Most self-help assumes you're okay enough to engage with it. Not happy, not thriving, but just steady enough that thinking about goals doesn't make your chest tighten. And when you're in that place, a lot of it works. Habits, identity change, meaning, direction, and that material is genuinely useful. But many people aren't there when they go looking for help. They can be exhausted, ashamed, already failing at things they care about. And they're then learning about habits and goals from inside a state where even small decisions feel heavy. And advice written for stability can feel brutal when you're reading it from inside that state, even if most of the time you function just fine. That's not when people are calmly planning self-improvement. That's when something has already slipped, when momentum has broken, when effort suddenly feels heavier than it did a week ago. And that's where things start to break. Because most people don't fail at self-improvement because they didn't understand the advice. They fail when momentum breaks, when they miss a day, when resistance shows up, when the effort itself starts to feel charged. That's when people go back to the advice, and that's where the mismatch appears. Because the advice itself usually isn't wrong. It just assumes you're still operating in the same state you were when you started. If you've watched the earlier videos on overload, avoidance, identity debt, small failures turning into big ones, you'll probably recognize the pattern. None of those failures happened because you didn't know what to do. They happened because thinking about what to do started to create pressure, and that pressure changed everything. So here's the mistake most self-help makes. It treats behavior as a motivation problem, or a discipline problem, or a values problem. So it gives advice that lives in the future. So, break it down. Visualize your future self. Be consistent. Remember your goals. And on a good day, they're fine. On a bad day, that mentality, that advice, feels like poison. Because when you're tired, overwhelmed, or already behind, your mind doesn't hear advice as guidance. It hears it as pressure. And pressure is exactly what triggers avoidance and overload. For a lot of people, the advice works briefly. There's a lift, a sense of clarity, maybe even a good week or two, and then that lift fades. And when it does, they're often left feeling more stuck than before. Because now, they're not just struggling, they're struggling despite knowing better. That's the pattern I've been trying to explain on this channel. Why it happens, and what actually works when it does. So what finally worked for me, it wasn't better motivation. It was learning how to avoid triggering that pressure in the first place. By shrinking action down to the smallest possible unit. Not the smallest meaningful unit, not the smallest productive unit, but the smallest action that creates no anxiety at all. So just sitting at the desk. That's it. That's the whole task. Turning the shower on. Done. Turning on the monitor. Opening the document. Each action is treated as complete in itself. There's no implied future, no and then, no requirement to continue. When the action is done, you don't have to just stop. You just choose the next action that feels just as easy. That's the key. Because the moment an action starts to imply a future, so effort, time, obligation, identity, everything tightens. You stop dealing with what's in front of you and start dealing with the story of the task. So how long it will take, what it means, how far behind you are, what this says about you. That's when things become overwhelming. So instead, I stay with what's concrete. One small practical action, then the next, then the next. All the while, you're gently training yourself to ignore everything else. The past, the future, the grand narrative about your life. Just the step that's right there. So small and easy that it doesn't need meaning attached to it. Your identity doesn't come into play. Your expectations don't come into play. And at some point, often without noticing, you realize you're already doing the thing. Momentum, when it comes, is a side effect. not a demand, not something you have to plan or optimize. And crucially, it works even when I'm exhausted, unmotivated, unhappy, or flat. Because it doesn't ask my nervous system for permission. It doesn't trigger any anxiety or any thought beyond what's next. And this is why a lot of good advice fails. It's not because it's wrong, but because it assumes you're operating normally. It assumes you can think clearly about the future, that you can tolerate pressure, that you can hold goals in mind without spiraling. But if you're already overloaded, the advice doesn't land as help. For a lot of people, it lands as accusation, an expectation that you'll now do better. And when it doesn't work, you don't conclude, this advice didn't match the moment I was in. You conclude, there's something wrong with me. That's the real damage. One of the very few frameworks I've found that gets this right is by B.J. Fogg in his book Tiny Habits. And it's not because it's clever, but because it refuses to rely on motivation at all. Actions are small enough to avoid triggering pressure. Completion is immediate. Nothing is owed. What I've been doing on this channel is building on that idea, adding language for what actually breaks when people try to improve themselves, and ways to stop the spiral when things don't go to plan. So this isn't about aiming higher. It's about knowing when aiming itself is the problem. So if we take one thing from this video, let it be this. When you're tired or overwhelmed, don't ask, what should I be doing? Instead ask, what is the smallest action I can take right now that produces no anxiety? And treat that as enough. No future, no verdict, no pressure, just one action. Because that's often all it takes to get unstuck. Not because you force momentum, but because you stop triggering the thing that was blocking it in the first place. That's the frame. From here, everything else we talk about, habits, consistency, recovery after slip-ups, starts to make sense. Not as self-improvement, but as learning how to work with yourself when things aren't ideal.